So last time we talked about the opera composer Rossini. He was an Italian, but he wrote funny operas. He wrote comic operas, and the Italians did not take to that very, very well. They preferred their operas to be more serious because they took opera so seriously. That was it was their legacy. It was their country's musical style. It's really where they felt that they shined. And so after Rossini moved away to London to be able to write his funny operas, there was this 50-year, a whole generation and a half, 50-year gap when there really was not any leading Italian opera composers until Giuseppe Verdi, 1813 to 1901. Verdi was exactly what the Italians wanted. A absolute master of writing opera, serious about opera, loved Italy. So, excuse me. So there was a long gap before Verdi, but then Verdi came in and really showed exactly what grand opera, an Italian grand opera, could be. There's very little argument that Verdi is not the greatest Italian opera composer of this generation. There are people who could even make an argument that he is the greatest composer of any style, although you could certainly argue that one. But as far as operas go, he really is unmatched. 26 operas in his lifetime. And he really worked to try to refine what opera could be to the point of perfection. Really testing and evolving and doing just his level best to figure out the best ways to do it. And so it's no wonder that today, almost 120 years later, we still look to Verdi as kind of the ultimate example, or at least one of the ultimate examples, of what Italian grand opera could be. Verdi also happened to align very closely with a nationalist movement in Italy at the exact same time. He wasn't the cause of it, and he didn't intentionally try to fit in with it. But it just so happened that at the time that he was alive and at the time that he was at the height of his fame was also the time of the Italian Revolution. Now, the Italians don't call it a revolution. They call it a reorganization. Now, it's a revolution, but they refer to it as the Risorgimento, the reorganization, the national rebirth, the kind of new dawn for Italy. And since Verdi happened to be alive at the time and was writing Italian operas at the time, he really became kind of the soundtrack of that Risorgimento. Add on to that the fact that the Risorgimento also included changing the monarchy. You see, if you remember back to when we talked about the classical period, one of the things that made travel for artists so good back in the classical period was that there were so many foreign rulers. There's a Spanish princess that was married to the King of England, and there was an English prince that became a German king. And so there are all these different rulers. The Italian king was not really of Italian descent. And so the people revolted and they wanted an Italian king on the throne. The man they wanted was named Victor Emmanuel. So they would when they took to the streets in the protest, they had this rallying cry where they would say, well, it translates as "Long live Victor Emmanuel, the true King of Italy." In Italian, that is "Viva Vittorio Emanuele, Re d'Italia." Now, if you look at those initial letters, you have for Vittoria, V, Emanuele, E, the E, Re, R, D for of, and I for Italia, Verdi. So when the people led their protests, one of the things you would hear them scream was "Viva Verdi, Viva Verdi, Viva Verdi." They were not chanting about the composer. This was "Long live the true king, Victor Emmanuel." But the fact that it worked so well with Verdi's name, and Verdi was the soundtrack of this movement, it it all works together. And so now when we look back on history, we see Verdi very much as this nationalist symbol for the Italian Risorgimento. But as an opera composer, he really is unparalleled. And he was lived during such a dynamic time. Like if you think about it, his first opera was composed and performed in a theater that was entirely lit by candles. And then his last opera was presented in a fully electrified theater. This was the time he was alive, the actual invention and beginning use of electricity. So it's a time when everything's changing, right? It's a time of radical shift. And the Italian reorganization. And Verdi is right there writing these meaningful stories set to beautiful music that kind of roused the national sentiment. Verdi had some very peculiar beliefs about opera. Number one, he believed that opera must be uplifting. The audience should leave the theater every time feeling like they were made better. Now, that does not mean happy. Not all of Verdi's operas are happy. In fact, not many of them are happy at all. Most operas aren't necessarily happy. But the emotional experience and the journey of having followed the story should leave people feeling changed and changed for the better. Have you ever had that experience in seeing a movie? You ever watched a show or a film, and at the end of it, you're just like, wow. And you really you want to talk to somebody about it because it's changed you. Or maybe you've read a book that had that same impact on you. That's what Verdi wanted opera to be. He hated the idea of opera for just sheer entertainment. He hated the idea of just comedy operas just to make people laugh. He wanted opera to have deep meaning. He also wanted operas to tell believable stories. He wanted them to be simple and natural. Now, that being said, this is the guy who wrote an opera that called for an elephant to march across the stage. I don't know anybody who would consider getting an elephant into a theater and having it walk across the stage as simple. But the point is, his stories do not involve magic. They don't involve legends and gods and goddesses. His stories are about real people in real situations. He also believed that the Italian composers should only write opera. No symphonies, no concertos, just opera, because that was their national music. The flip side of this is he believed that nobody else should write operas. He hated it when the Germans tried to write operas. He believed that was just one of the most offensive things ever. Call it cultural appropriation, if you will. To his mind, opera belonged to the Italians. And so through his work, he helped refine the style, less about the divas, more about the story, focusing on the human drama. Now, one interesting little tidbit about him is every morning, to warm up, to get himself ready to compose, he would sit down at his piano with a music paper in front of him and a pen, and he would compose a fugue. Now, we've talked about fugues. Fugues are popular back in the time of Bach, and they are incredibly complicated to write. They are very difficult because you're literally figuring out ways to write 4 different parts that all fit together neatly with everything sounding good. It is incredibly hard to write a fugue. He would do this every morning. This was his warm-up. And then when he was done, he would sit at his piano, he would perform it through, then he would take the music, crumple it up, and throw it in the fire. He said this, he used that exercise to get the quote-unquote bad notes out so that he could then focus on opera the rest of the day. He wrote an incredibly complicated piece of music every day, destroyed it, and then worked on his work. Hey, who does that, right? Could you imagine a student who's like, all right, well, I have a paper on Romeo and Juliet that's due. So before I write that one, I'm going to do a research paper on some other topic just to get all the, just to get the words flowing. Then I'm going to throw away this research project that I wrote. And after I've done that, then I'll write my paper for my English class, right? Who does that? Nobody does that. Verdi did this. This was just the way his mind worked. Brilliant, but had some, shall we say, peculiarities. Now, 26 operas, all of them have something good in it, but probably one of his best known is the song La Donna Mobile from the opera Rigoletto. That's one of the ones that I'm going to want you to listen to. You've probably heard it before. It's used a lot in movies to depict wealth and prestige. It's also used in a ton of Italian restaurants. So like if your family's ever gone to Olive Garden and actually sat down to eat a meal, I can guarantee you've heard La Donna Mobile. It's played in that restaurant at least once an hour. Okay, it is a classic quote unquote Italian song. So we'll listen to that one. He wrote a great opera called Il Trovatore that dealt with the issue of the gypsies. These were kind of outcasts. They were migrants, immigrants, if you will, and they weren't trusted anywhere, especially they weren't trusted in Italy. And yet he writes this opera that really humanized them. And it has a very famous song called the Anvil Chorus. Again, used in a lot of cartoons. You've probably heard it before. Dun, 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 dun. And it's called the Anvil Chorus because in the story, the gypsies have taken a job at a blacksmith shop. And so they're working with these big anvils and red hot metal and got the hammers and clang, clang, clang. And they're hitting the hammer on the anvil. Kind of like Tchaikovsky with the 1812 Overture. Verdi's like, I want it to sound like they're working in a blacksmith shop. What instruments sound like a blacksmith shop? Nothing sounds like a blacksmith shop. So what does he do instead? He says, all right, get a 2,000-pound anvil, giant 1-ton chunk of metal, and then get a big hammer and just play that, whack the giant hammer. So if you listen to the anvil chorus and it's performed correctly, you'll hear this gang, 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 gang sound being played that literally is a hammer on an anvil. We're not going to listen to that one right now, but if you enjoy Verdi's music, it would be worth seeking out on your own. Same with La Traviata. Absolutely amazing music. Not really anything that's particularly standout famous, but as a complete show, it's wonderful. I'm going to jump to the last one, Falstaff, one of only 2 attempts he made at doing anything even remotely funny with a show called Falstaff. It's another interesting one. The one that probably becomes the most famous of his is his 1871 opera Aida. This was written for the country of Egypt. Egypt had just completed a massive project called the Suez Canal. Basically, before this project, if you wanted to get from, like, say, Italy to Spain on the map, you either had to go through all of Europe, which included going over the Swiss Alps, which are really, really hard to cross, or getting on a boat and going all the way down to the bottom of Africa, following Africa all the way around to get to the other side. It took weeks. And when it comes to commerce, weeks can be a problem. Things go bad when you have to take weeks to get your goods somewhere. So the Egyptians literally blasted a river. They used dynamite and amazing engineering to make this canal so that now you could just go through this skinny little man-made river without having to go all the way around Africa. They just finished this and they wanted to celebrate in world-class style. They wanted the world to take notice. And the Egyptians knew that in the rest of Europe, when something big like this happened, there was usually an opera that was commissioned to celebrate it. There were no Egyptian opera composers. That just wasn't part of their culture. So the king of Egypt contacted Verdi saying, "You're the most famous opera composer in the world. Will you write this piece for us?" And so Verdi writes this opera called Aida. And it's about Hannibal, who is a Roman emperor who conquered large parts of Africa, and about the princess Aida and their romance. So it's a story that deals with Africa and deals with Egypt, but it's still also very European in its sensibilities. That's why this opera has things like elephants marching across the stage, right? Because we think about African animals and we think about elephants as well as lions, as well as like wildebeest and giraffes. So he wanted this idea of a triumphal parade. Hannibal's coming back and he's showing off everything that he's conquered: the gold, the jewels, yes, slaves, but also these exotic animals. The song that is played for that is called the Triumphal March. And it's this scene where he's marching across the stage, showing off everything that he has earned from his great campaign. For some reason, and I I've looked into this. I've done research on it and I cannot figure out when this happened. But for some reason, this song, the Triumphal March from Aida, has become associated with quinceañeras. Like I say, I don't understand why, but I do know that I've had a lot of students say, "Hey, that song was played at my quinceañera." It was, it's often one of the songs that's played during the presentation, but it was originally written as part of this opera in this scene where these wild animals were being presented. So it's an interesting example of how sometimes music gets used in ways that we never expected. but it is one that I do want you to listen to. So all these operas are definitely good, but we're going to pause here and listen to two examples. We're going to listen to La Donna Mobile from Rigoletto, and we're going to listen to the Triumphal March from Aida. And I think that'll give you a good sample of Verdi's music.